The phone rang in the McCartney household on a cold evening in November 1980. Paul McCartney reached for the receiver and heard a voice he knew better than almost any other voice in the world. It was John Lennon calling from New York City. The two men talked for over an hour about their lives and their families and their music. They laughed together like old times. They shared their hopes and dreams for the future. Neither man had any idea this would be their final conversation. Within weeks, John would be dead, and Paul would spend the rest of his life thinking about those last words they shared. For over 40 years, Paul kept the intimate details of that phone call private. But now, at 80 years old, he has finally opened up about what John really said during those precious final moments. What he reveals will shock you and move you, and change everything you thought you knew about these two. Legends, before we dive into video, please subscribe to our channel. Imagine being half of the greatest songwriting partnership in history. Imagine creating music that defined an entire generation and changed culture forever. Now imagine that partnership ending in bitterness and anger and years of painful silence. Then imagine getting your friend back only to lose him forever, just as things were getting good again. This is the story of Paul McCartney and John Lennon. This is the story of a friendship that survived fame and fortune and breakups and lawsuits only to be cut short by tragedy. This is the story of a last phone call and the words that still echo through the decades. Paul McCartney and John Lennon first met in July 1957 at a church garden party in Liverpool, England. Paul was 15 years old and John was 16. John was performing with his skiffle group called the Quarrymen when Paul showed up to watch. After the performance, Paul impressed John by playing guitar and showing him how to tune it properly. That meeting changed both their lives forever. Within weeks, Paul had joined the Quarrymen, and the two teenagers began writing songs together. They would sit facing each other with their guitars and work out melodies and lyrics for hours. This was the beginning of the Lennon-McCartney partnership that would produce some of the greatest songs ever written. From the very start, Paul and John had an almost magical creative chemistry. What one lacked, the other provided. John was edgy and rebellious and raw. Paul was melodic and polished and versatile. Together they balanced each other perfectly. John pushed Paul to be more daring and experimental. Paul pushed John to refine his ideas and make them accessible. They challenged each other and inspired each other and brought out the best in each other. The songs poured out of them. She Loves You, I Want to Hold Your Hand, A Hard Day's Night, Help, Yesterday, Norwegian Wood, Strawberry Fields Forever, Penny Lane, All You Need Is Love, Hey Jude, Come Together, Let It Be. The list goes on and on. But the Beatles were not just Paul and John. George Harrison brought his own unique guitar style and songwriting talents. Ringo Starr provided the steady drumming that held everything together. The four of them became more than a band. They became a cultural phenomenon that swept across the world. Beatlemania took over in the 1960s. Everywhere the Beatles went, thousands of screaming fans mobbed them. Their concerts were so loud with screaming that the band members could not even hear themselves play. They appeared on television shows and in movies. They met queens and presidents. They were the biggest thing in entertainment, and it all happened so fast. Through all the chaos and craziness, Paul and John remained close. They were partners in the truest sense. They shared hotel rooms on tour. They gave interviews together. They wrote songs together even when they were physically apart. Paul would start a song and John would finish it, or vice versa. Sometimes they wrote songs separately, but still credited them to Lennon-McCartney, because that was their agreement. They were in it together no matter what. The world saw them as a unit, and in many ways they were. They understood each other in ways that other people could not fully grasp. But success and fame put pressure on their relationship. By the late 1960s, the Beatles were starting to fracture. The death of their manager Brian Epstein in 1967 left them without the person who had guided them and held them together. John met Yoko Ono and fell deeply in love, and she became a constant presence in the recording studio, which bothered the other band members. Paul tried to take control and keep the Beatles functioning, which made the others feel like he was being bossy. George wanted more recognition for his own songwriting. Ringo felt underappreciated. The sessions for the White Album in 1968 were tense and difficult. The Get Back sessions in early 1969 were even worse. Paul and John were no longer on the same page. They had different visions for what the Beatles should be doing. They had different priorities in their personal lives. John was pulling away and Paul was trying to hold on, and neither approach was working. The arguments became more frequent. The creative partnership that had once been effortless now felt like hard work. They still respected each other's talents, but the easy friendship of their youth was slipping away under the weight of money and fame and personal changes. The Beatles recorded their final album Abbey Road in the summer of 1969. It was a brilliant record, but everyone knew it was the end. Paul announced he was leaving the band in April 1970. The news devastated fans around the world. The Beatles were breaking up, and nothing would ever be the same. What followed was a very ugly period. There were lawsuits as Paul sued to dissolve the Beatles' partnership. John was furious about the lawsuit and said harsh things about Paul in interviews. Paul responded with his own hurt feelings in the press. They accused each other of various betrayals. It was painful to watch two people who had once been so close now treating each other like enemies. Throughout the early and mid-1970s, Paul and John barely spoke. They lived on different continents. Paul was in England and Scotland with his wife Linda and their growing family. John was in New York City with Yoko and eventually their son Sean, who was born in 1975. They communicated mainly through their music. Paul would write songs that seemed to reference John. John would write songs that seemed to be aimed at Paul. Fans analyzed every lyric looking for hidden meanings and messages. It was sad because these two men who had created so much beautiful music together were now using music to take shots at each other. But time has a way of healing wounds. By the late 1970s, the anger was starting to fade. Both Paul and John had moved on with their lives. Paul had formed a new band called Wings and had massive success with songs like Band on the Run and Live, and Let Die and Silly Love Songs. John had taken a break from music to be a house husband and raise his son Sean. The distance and time apart gave them both perspective. They started to remember the good times instead of just the bad times. They started to miss what they had lost. In 1980, John Lennon came back to music after 5 years away. He released a new album called Double Fantasy with Yoko. The album was personal and honest and showed John in a new light as a devoted father and husband. He gave interviews where he spoke about the Beatles with fondness instead of bitterness. He talked about Paul with respect and warmth. He seemed to be at peace with his past and excited about his future. This softer, more open version of John made it easier for Paul to reach out. The phone calls between Paul and John started happening more regularly in 1980. They were friendly and relaxed. They talked about everyday things like baking bread and raising kids. John told Paul about his years away from music and how much he had learned about himself. Paul told John about his life with Linda and Wings. They laughed about old times and old friends. The bitterness was gone. The competition was gone. They were just two middle-aged men who had known each other since they were teenagers and had been through extraordinary things together. That last phone call in November 1980 was longer than most. Paul has revealed that John was in a particularly good mood. He was happy about how Double Fantasy was being received. He was happy about his life in general. He talked about Sean and how much joy being a father brought him. He talked about how different things were this time around compared to when his first son Julian was born during the height of Beatlemania. John said he felt like he had finally gotten his priorities straight after years of confusion and chaos. Then the conversation turned to music and the old days. John told Paul that he had been thinking a lot about their partnership lately. He said that despite all the incredible musicians he had worked with over the years, nothing quite compared to writing with Paul. John said there was a magic that happened when they worked together that he had never been able to replicate with anyone else. He said their minds worked in complementary ways that produced something greater than either of them could create alone. Paul has revealed that John then said something that meant the world to him. John said he loved Paul. He said it simply and directly, without any embarrassment or hesitation. He said that Paul was one of the most important people in his life and always would be. He said that all the fighting and lawsuits and angry words did not change the fundamental truth that they had an unbreakable bond. They had grown up together and conquered the world together, and that kind of shared history creates a connection that lasts forever. John also told Paul that he wanted them to write together again. Not for a Beatles reunion or for publicity or for money, just because making music together was one of the great joys of his life, and he wanted to experience that again. John said maybe they could get together in the new year and just see what happened. No pressure, no expectations. Just two old friends sitting down with guitars like they did when they were teenagers in Liverpool. Paul remembers feeling thrilled at the prospect. He had missed working with John so much. He had missed the creative spark that only John could provide. He told John that he would love to write together again, and they should definitely make plans for early 1981. They talked about maybe Paul coming to New York, or John coming to England. They talked about renting a quiet studio somewhere and just spending a few days playing around with ideas. They were both excited about the possibilities. Before they hung up, John said one more thing that Paul thinks about all the time. John said that he felt lucky to have had the life he had, lucky to have made the music he made, lucky to have known and worked with Paul, lucky to have Yoko and Sean, lucky to be alive and healthy and happy. John said he was looking forward to the next chapter of his life and all the adventures it would bring. He sounded hopeful and optimistic and full of life. Paul said goodbye to John that night feeling wonderful. He thought about the songs they would write together. He imagined the two of them getting back into the rhythm of collaboration. He felt grateful that they had repaired their friendship and moved past all the hurt. He went to bed that night thinking everything was right with the world and the future looked bright. On December 8, 1980, Paul McCartney was in a recording studio when someone told him that John Lennon had been shot in New York City. At first, Paul thought it must be a mistake or a sick joke. But then the reports kept coming in, and the horrible truth became undeniable. John Lennon was dead. He had been murdered by a deranged fan outside his apartment building. He was only 40 years old. All those plans for writing together again were gone. All those future conversations would never happen. The phone would never ring with John on the other end again. Paul was devastated in ways he could barely express. He did not know how to process the grief. How do you mourn someone who was such a huge part of your life for so long? How do you accept that someone so vital and alive could just be gone in an instant? Paul threw himself into his work because work was something he could control. But late at night when everything was quiet, the loss would hit him like a wave. John was gone, and nothing would ever fill that hole. For many years, Paul rarely spoke about that last phone call in detail. It felt too private and too precious to share with the world. Those words were his to hold on to during the dark times. Knowing that his last conversation with John had been loving and positive was a comfort. At least they had not parted in anger. At least John knew how much Paul valued him. At least their last words were about music and friendship and love. But as Paul has grown older, he has become more open about his feelings regarding John. He has talked in interviews about how much he misses his old friend. He has written songs dedicated to John's memory, like Here Today, where he expresses all the things he wishes he had said. He has spoken at length about the Beatles' years and what that time meant to him. And now at 80 years old, Paul has decided to share more details about that final phone call. Paul says he shares these details now because he wants people to understand the true nature of his relationship with John. Yes, they fought. Yes, the breakup was ugly. Yes, they said things they regretted. But underneath all of that was a deep and genuine love. They were brothers in every way that mattered. The last phone call proved that their bond survived everything that tried to destroy it. That is important for people to know. Paul also shares these details because he wants to honor John's memory properly. John was not just the angry, rebellious Beatle. He was not just the guy who broke up the band. He was a complex human being who struggled and grew and eventually found peace. The John that Paul spoke to in November 1980 was a man who had done the hard work of looking at himself honestly and making changes. That version of John deserves to be remembered too. The revelation about their last conversation also serves as a reminder about what matters in life. Paul and John wasted years being angry at each other over things that seem petty in hindsight. They let pride and hurt feelings keep them apart when they could have been creating beautiful music together. They almost ran out of time to fix things. The fact that they managed to reconcile before John died is a miracle. But how much more time could they have had if they had let go of the anger sooner? Paul wants people to learn from his experience. He wants people to tell their loved ones how they feel while there is still time. He wants people to forgive old grudges and repair broken relationships before it is too late. He wants people to prioritize what really matters, which is love and connection and shared joy. These are the lessons he learned the hard way through losing John. At 80 years old, Paul McCartney still performs and records music. He still tours the world playing Beatles songs to crowds who sing along to every word. When he performs those songs, he thinks about John. He feels John's presence in the melodies and the lyrics. He honors his old friend every time he steps on stage. The music they created together will outlive them both and touch generations that have not even been born yet. Paul knows he is one of the lucky ones. Despite all the pain of losing John, he got that last phone call. He got to hear John say he loved him one more time. He got to know that John died happy and at peace and looking forward to the future. He got closure even if he did not know that was what it was at the time. Many people do not get that gift. Many people lose loved ones with things left unsaid and relationships left unrepaired. The last phone call between Paul McCartney and John Lennon was about love and music and second chances. It was about two men who had been through everything together finding their way back to each other. It was about forgiveness and growth and the enduring power of friendship. Those final words that John spoke have sustained Paul through 4 decades of grief and loss. They remind him that what he and John had was real and special and eternal. Nothing can take that away. Not death, not time, not anything.